Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving headfirst into a case that really, I think, highlights how complicated divorce and child custody and co-parenting can get.
Yeah, especially when things get really messy.
Yeah, you ready for this? This one's a doozy.
Hit me with it.
All right, so we're looking at a 2024 decision from the Ontario Superior Court of Justice, the case of Albaz v. Rihawi, and it gives us a look into this family just grappling with some incredibly tough situations, and we get to see what the judge ultimately decided.
Exactly. And, we're dealing with Meys Albaz and Mahmoud Rihawi, parents of four, whose marriage has kind of unfortunately fallen apart.
Yeah, it's a sad situation for sure.
And what makes this case really interesting and at times quite heartbreaking is just the massive amount of conflict between these two parents. And you could just see how much it's impacting their children.
Okay, so paint a picture for us here.
All right, so
Who are these people?
I've got a couple who split up somewhere between 2017 and 2018.
Okay.
And even the date of separation is something that they can't agree on. They've got four kids ranging in age from 8 to 16.
A big family.
And to make things even more complicated, both parents are representing themselves in court.
Oh boy, that's never easy.
No, it's not.
Especially when you're dealing with something as emotionally charged as a divorce.
Absolutely. And to top it all off, it seems like they disagree on pretty much every single aspect of their separation.
So basically, like the textbook definition of a high conflict divorce.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. This case throws pretty much every family law issue imaginable at the judge.
Okay, so walk us through it. What are we talking about here?
So we're talking divorce, of course, but also who gets to make the decisions about the kids' lives, how much time they get to spend with each parent, how are they going to split up their assets and debts,
Right.
what's going to happen to the family house, who pays for what after they separate,
It's a lot.
child support. We're talking current child support, and there's a bunch of back payments owed,
Oh, wow.
spousal support, and is a restraining order even necessary?
So you're saying like the whole 9 yards?
The whole 9 yards. This is every possible issue you could think of in a family law case. It's all here.
And I imagine for our listeners who, maybe aren't super familiar with all the ins and outs of family law, this case really throws all those hot button issues right out in the open.
Absolutely. And this case really gets into the fine details, the nitty-gritty of how judges actually apply the law to these messy real life situations.
All right, so let's get into the specifics here. The case file really gives us this up close and personal look at the family dynamics at play here, and it's pretty intense. We learn that Mahmoud was actually arrested twice. Once for allegedly assaulting Meys, although he was acquitted by a court,
Right.
and then another time for allegedly threatening one of their daughters.
Yeah, and the details of those alleged incidents, they're pretty disturbing. I mean, the judge even described one of the altercations as extremely violent.
So it sounds like things got pretty out of hand.
Oh, absolutely. Things were definitely volatile. And to make matters even worse, two of the older children have completely cut off contact with their father.
So we're not talking just a little disagreement here. This is deep-seated estrangement.
Right, and it really speaks to just the depth of this conflict and the huge impact it's having on these kids. I mean, just imagine you're a teenager and you feel so alienated from your own parent that you just refuse to have any contact with them.
That's a powerful statement.
It really is.
And you know what I find really fascinating is that even with this level of animosity and conflict, there are still these moments where it seems like they're trying to maintain some semblance of family life. Like Mahmoud insists on paying the mahr,
Yeah.
this Islamic marriage payment, even while he's fighting tooth and nail about other parts of the divorce settlement.
It's almost like he's trying to balance his cultural and religious obligations with this incredibly messy separation.
It really is.
And the judge actually spends quite a bit of time discussing how Canadian courts try to incorporate these cultural considerations. It's like a reminder that family law isn't just about black and white rules. It's about real people with different backgrounds and beliefs.
It's about their real lives.
Absolutely.
And speaking of real lives and relationships, there's this detail about Mahmoud accessing Meys's travel information through Air Canada's employee system.
Ooh, yeah.
He worked for the airline.
Right.
And, I mean, for our listener, put yourself in Meys's shoes for a second. How would you feel knowing that your ex had access to all of this private information?
That would be incredibly violating.
It's a huge invasion of privacy.
Absolutely. And the judge actually uses some pretty strong language to describe this incident, calling it scary and an alarming breach of privacy. And, it makes you wonder about Mahmoud's respect for boundaries, right?
For sure. And, this is something you see a lot in these high conflict divorce cases. It's
Yeah.
One party is constantly trying to exert control or get some kind of leverage over the other.
Yeah, it's a power struggle.
It is. It really is. And it seems like this need for control pops up again and again throughout the case. Like, Mahmoud tries to claim that Meys is turning the kids against him, but the judge didn't buy it.
Right.
It makes you wonder how often these parental alienation claims are used, maybe not always sincerely in these types of disputes.
Well, parental alienation is a very real issue, and it can be incredibly damaging for children. But judges are extremely cautious when they're evaluating those kinds of claims.
Right, they have to be.
They're looking for hard evidence and a consistent pattern of behavior, not just one parent's word against the other.
Makes sense.
And in this particular case, it seems like the judge felt that Mahmoud's own actions played a major role in damaging his relationships with his children.
So it's all so intertwined.
It really is.
And then you have Meys admitting to putting hot sauce in her son's mouth as a form of discipline. How is a judge even supposed to, weigh something like that against everything else?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting, because the judge is forced to confront some pretty tough questions. On the one hand, you have this incident that definitely raises concerns. But on the other hand, you have to consider the whole context, the history of alleged abuse, the power dynamics, and what's truly in the best interests of the child. It's not about judging Meys' parenting choices in isolation, but trying to understand how this one incident fits into the bigger picture of this family's struggles.
So it's about context.
Absolutely.
So how did the judge ultimately sort through this whole mess? What were the key takeaways from a legal perspective?
What's really interesting is the judge's analysis is incredibly thorough, and it gives us some really valuable insights into how these cases are decided. So, for example, there's this fascinating discussion about how judges figure out custody arrangements, and they really focus on the specific needs of each child. And the parent's ability to meet those needs is not just about who's the better parent, but who can provide the most stable and nurturing environment for each kid individually.
Okay, so it's not one size fits all.
Not at all.
It's very much tailored to the specific circumstances.
Absolutely. And this is where things get even more complicated, because the judge also has to consider the allegations of family violence and decide, are they credible? And if so, how much weight should they carry in making a custody decision?
Right, because these allegations are incredibly serious and, they can have a major impact on the kid's safety and well-being.
Absolutely.
So how did the judge approach these specific allegations in this case? What evidence did they find most compelling?
Well, that's what we're going to be diving into in the next part of our deep dive, so stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Albaz v. Rihawi.
Yeah.
Before we took a break, we were talking about the judge's really tough job of figuring out, how much weight to give to those family violence allegations and how that impacts custody decisions.
Right. It's a big deal.
It's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But it's the reality for so many families that are going through these types of separations. And, it's important to remember when we talk about these allegations of abuse, the judge's main concern is always the kid's safety and well-being.
Right, because they're the most vulnerable in these situations.
Absolutely.
The court has to protect them. So how did the judge approach these allegations? What was their process?
Okay, so first we need to remember that in family court, the standard of proof, it's different than in criminal court.
Okay.
So in criminal court, you have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, right?
Like, that's the bar.
That's a really high bar to clear. But in family court, the standard is something called on a balance of probabilities.
So does that mean it's easier to prove abuse in family court?
Well, it's not really about being easier, but it means that the judge is looking at all the evidence and deciding which side's story is more likely to be true.
Okay, so it's about probability.
Exactly. And in this case, the judge decided that Meys' allegations of abuse were more believable than Mahmoud's denials.
Okay, so what made her story more convincing?
Well, there are a few things that seem to influence the judge. For example, Meys gave very detailed descriptions of specific incidents. She had dates and times and locations.
Wow, so specific.
And she also had evidence to back up her claims. Things like photographs of injuries and text messages from Mahmoud that were kind of threatening.
So she had receipts.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't just her word against his. And that's such a crucial point for anyone listening who might be going through something similar. Documentation can be so important.
Absolutely. Keep records.
Yes. And the judge also noticed this pattern of behavior from Mahmoud that raised some red flags, like that incident where he allegedly ripped up the kid's allowance money
Oh, gosh.
after yelling at one of them.
That's intense.
It is, and it seems to connect back to what we were talking about earlier,
Yeah.
about his need to control the situation, even down to, like, the kid's finances.
Yeah, it's like a pattern.
It does seem that way. And remember that incident with Mahmoud accessing Mays's travel information through Air Canada.
Right.
Well, the judge saw that as part of this bigger picture of controlling behavior.
Yeah.
They called it another example of Mahmoud's disregard for boundaries and his willingness to use whatever means necessary to exert control over Mays.
So it wasn't just an isolated incident.
Nope, it was part of this larger pattern.
Okay, so we're starting to get this really in-depth look at the judge's reasoning. But what about the kids? How did they factor into all of this, especially those two teenagers who had stopped seeing their dad?
Right. That's such an important point, and it's honestly one of the most emotionally charged parts of this whole case.
Definitely.
And the judge was very clear about respecting those teenagers' decisions.
Okay.
The existing parenting time order technically still stands, but the judge said that it wouldn't be enforced by police.
So, like, they're not going to force those kids to see their father.
Exactly. And it's interesting because it raises this really complex question about a child's right to choose versus a parent's right to have a relationship with their kid.
Yeah, how do you balance those two things?
It's a tough one because on one hand, you want to protect those kids from potentially harmful situations. But on the other hand, you don't want to completely sever that parent-child bond if there's any chance of reconciliation.
Right, because sometimes those relationships can be repaired.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's this constant balancing act. And judges have to deal with it all the time.
It's got to be one of the hardest parts of the job.
It really does. And in this case, it seems like the judge decided to prioritize those teenagers' well-being and kind of acknowledge that forcing them to see their dad could actually do more harm than good at this point. But it's not a decision that they made lightly.
No, of course not. And I think at this point, our listeners might be wondering, well, what about the younger kids? Do their opinions carry the same weight?
That's a great question. And obviously, younger children might not be as good at expressing their wishes or standing up for themselves like a teenager might.
Right, they're still developing those skills.
Exactly. So in those situations, the judge has to rely more on the evidence that the parents provide, maybe some expert testimony from child psychologists or social workers, and their own observations of how the child interacts with each parent.
Okay, so they have to be more like detectives almost.
Yeah, it's a lot more subjective.
It's a lot more nuanced.
It really is, and this case just highlights how challenging these decisions can be for judges.
Right.
It's not about just applying some formula or a set of rules. It's about understanding how families work, the impact of trauma, and what the long-term effects might be for everyone involved.
This is real-life stuff.
It is.
And it brings us back to that hot sauce incident with Mays. Did the judge have anything to say about that?
Oh, yeah, they definitely addressed it. And it's interesting because you can really see the judge grappling with this concept of imperfect parenting.
Okay. So, like, nobody's perfect.
Exactly. And the judge even pointed out that Mays initially tried to downplay what happened, which made her seem less credible. But in the end, the judge decided that this incident didn't show a pattern of behavior that would put the children at risk.
Okay, so it was taken into account, but it wasn't like the deciding factor in the custody decision.
Exactly. And for our listeners, this really illustrates how judges look at all these different factors.
Right.
They're looking for consistency patterns, trying to figure out what's really best for the child.
So they're trying to see the whole picture.
Exactly. They're not looking for perfect parents. They're looking for parents who can provide a safe and stable and loving home for their kids, even when they're going through this really difficult divorce.
That makes a lot of sense, and this is where we see the judge kind of shifting their focus a bit from those allegations of abuse to the more practical aspects of the separation.
Right.
Things like who gets to make decisions about the kids' education and healthcare, how is parenting time going to work, and of course the big one, money.
Ah, yes, the financial side of things.
Because divorce isn't just emotionally messy,
Right.
it can be financially devastating too. So how did the judge handle all of that in this case?
Well, that's what we're going to explore in the final part of our deep dive. Stay with us.
Welcome back to the deep dive. It's amazing how much we've uncovered just by looking at this one case. Albaz v. Rihawi. We've talked about the conflict, the allegations of abuse, the impact on those kids. It's a lot to take in.
It really is.
But, like you were saying before the break, there's this whole other layer to this story, the financial side of the divorce.
Oh, yeah. No,
But for anyone who's ever gone through a divorce or even thought about it, money can be a huge point of contention.
Oh, absolutely. It can be a major battleground. And in this case, it's not just about dividing assets or figuring out child support. It's about power and control.
Ooh. Okay, give us the details. What happened?
So remember how we were talking about Mahmoud's need to control things?
Yeah.
Well, that really played out in how he handled the finances.
Okay, so like how?
For example, he stopped paying child support for a while, even though the court had ordered him to.
Oh, wow. So he just decided not to pay.
Yeah, he claimed he couldn't afford it, but the judge wasn't buying it.
So what did the judge do?
Well, it wasn't quite as simple as just saying, pay up. You see, Mahmoud tried to argue that the original child support agreement was linked to Meys selling the house, which he hadn't done yet.
Okay.
But here's the thing. The court order didn't actually say anything about the house sale being a condition for the child support.
Oh, interesting.
And this is where I think our listeners can learn a really important lesson.
Okay.
When you're dealing with court orders, especially in family law, it's so crucial to make sure everything is spelled out clearly in writing.
Right, because if it's not in the order, it's like it never happened.
Exactly. You can't just rely on verbal agreements or assumptions. The court goes by what's in the official documents.
So what did the judge do about Mahmoud refusing to pay child support?
The judge basically called him out on it.
Good.
The ruling actually says that Mahmoud cannot unilaterally decide to stop paying child support because he is dissatisfied with Meys's actions.
Wow, strong words.
And it really gets to the core issue. You can't use your kids' financial support as a bargaining chip in a divorce.
It's not fair to the kids.
It's not.
So it seems like Mahmoud wasn't really scoring any points with his financial tactics. So how did the judge decide to split up their assets? Was it like a straight 50-50 split?
Not quite. Remember, in Canada, we have this concept called equalization of net family property.
Right.
Which basically means you try to divide up the couple's assets and debts that they accumulated during the marriage as equally as possible.
Okay.
But it's not always as simple as just cutting everything in half.
Right.
There can be all sorts of deductions and exemptions and adjustments based on the specific circumstances of each case.
So how did it all work out in this case?
Well, the judge had to go through piles of financial documents, bank statements, tax returns, property valuations, the whole shebang.
That sounds like fun.
And remember, both parties were representing themselves. So the paperwork wasn't always the most organized or easy to follow. But the judge really meticulously went through everything, trying to piece together a clear picture of their financial situation.
Okay.
And after taking into account all the assets and the debts and even the Mahmoud, the judge ordered Mahmoud to pay Meys over $10,000 in equalization.
Wow. So even though they weren't splitting things exactly down the middle, the judge still aimed for a fair division.
Yeah.
Taking into account all the details of their financial history.
Fairness is the goal, not necessarily perfect equality.
Right.
And that brings us to another big piece of the financial puzzle, child support.
Okay.
And as you can imagine, with fluctuating incomes and shared parenting time, and then you throw in the fact that two of the kids had stopped seeing their father calculated child support in this case, it was quite the challenge.
I bet so. How did the judge even begin to figure out how much should be paid?
Well, there are guidelines in place to help determine child support amounts. And these guidelines take into account things like each parent's income, the number of children, how much time each parent spends with the kids.
All right.
But in this case, things were a bit messier because Mahmoud had times when he was unemployed, Meys wasn't working outside the home, and then there were those two older kids who weren't seeing their dad anymore.
Right. So how did the judge handle all of that? Did Mahmoud get a discount on child support because those two kids weren't seeing him?
No, he did not. And this is a really important point for our listeners. Child support is for the benefit of the child, regardless of whether they're actively seeing the paying parent.
Right.
The judge actually addressed this directly, saying that the children's decision to not see Mahmoud does not affect his obligation to pay child support.
That makes sense. Those kids still need financial support whether they see their dad or not.
Exactly.
So how much child support did the judge order him to pay?
Well, the judge did a very detailed calculation, taking into account all the different factors we've talked about, and ultimately ordered Mahmoud to pay over $800 per month in ongoing child support.
Okay.
But that's not all of that. Remember how he had stopped paying for a while?
Yeah.
The judge also awarded Meys over $80,000 in retroactive child support to cover those missed payments.
Wow, that's a lot of money.
It is. It really goes to show you that you can try to avoid your financial obligations, but the court can and will hold you accountable.
Right. You can't just ignore a court order.
You can't. And that brings us to the last piece of the financial puzzle, spousal support.
All right.
And this is where things get a bit more nuanced, because the judge had to consider Meys' earning capacity, even though she hadn't been working outside the home for quite a few years.
So even though she'd been the primary caregiver for the kids, the judge still expected her to contribute financially.
Right. The judge imputed an income to Mays, meaning they estimated how much she could potentially earn based on her education and work history.
Right.
And based on that imputed income, the judge determined that she wouldn't be eligible for spousal support under the guidelines.
So they looked at what she could be making if she went back to work.
Right. The judge took a very practical approach, recognizing that even though she'd been focused on raising the kids, she now had the potential to re-enter the workforce and support herself.
But what about Mahmoud? Did he ask for any financial support from Mays?
He did, actually. He made a claim for occupation rent.
Occupation rent.
Yeah, he argued that Mays should pay him for the time she lived in the house alone after he moved out.
Okay.
But the judge dismissed that claim.
Why is that? It seems like a pretty common thing in divorce cases, right?
It is. But in this case, the judge pointed out that Mahmoud hadn't been paying the mortgage or contributing to child support during that time, and he hadn't taken any legal steps to try to force a sale of the house or get exclusive possession. So the judge basically said, you can't have it both ways. You can't shirk your responsibilities and then demand compensation.
Wow, that's got to stink.
Yeah, the judge wasn't having any of it. And, for our listeners, this really emphasizes the fact that family court judges are looking for fairness and accountability.
Right.
They're not going to reward bad behavior or let one person take advantage of the other.
It's about doing the right thing.
It is. And, as we wrap up our deep dive into this case, I keep coming back to the judge's closing remarks.
Yeah.
The judge actually made this plea to both Mays and Mahmoud, urging them to use this ruling as a chance for a fresh start.
Wow.
To really look at their own actions, put their kids first, and try to find a way to co-parent effectively.
It's a powerful message.
It is. It's a reminder that the legal system can only do so much. Real change has to come from the parents themselves.
It's about putting the kids first.
Absolutely. Their kids' well-being depends on it.
That's a great point to end on. We've covered so much today: the conflict, the legal battles, the financial struggles, and most importantly, the impact on the children involved. It's a story that really makes you think about your own relationships, your own family, and how we navigate the ups and downs of life, love, loss, and all the complexities of modern families.
It reminds us that behind every legal case, there are real people with real emotions facing real consequences.
Right.
And while the law provides a framework for resolving these disputes, it's up to us as individuals and as a society to find ways to support families, especially during these tough times.
Absolutely well said. And on that note, we're going to leave you to ponder all of this. We hope you found our deep dive into the Albaz v. Rihawi case informative and thought-provoking, maybe even a little bit inspiring. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the world around you.